Colorado Territory, 1869. Winter had come early to the mining town of Silver Creek, leaving the mountains shrouded in a thick blanket of snow and the townsfolk scrambling for supplies. The howling wind carried ice that bit at exposed skin like tiny daggers, slicing through even the thickest clothing and chilling to the bone. It was the kind of cold that killed, and everyone knew it. Thomas Forrester pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders as he trudged through the ankle-deep snow toward the general store. At 25, he'd already seen more than his fair share of frontier hardship. 5 years as a cowhand had hardened his muscles and weathered his skin, though his face still held the youthful handsomeness that made the local girls giggle when he passed. His light stubble framed a strong jaw, and his blue eyes held a wariness that came from learning early that the West was no place for the soft-hearted. "A man stands alone out here," his father had told him before dying of fever 3 winters back. "Trust no one but yourself and your horse." Those words had become his creed. The unmarked graves of dreamers and romantics littered the trail west, men who'd put faith in partners, friends, or worse, love. Thomas had seen too many good men die because they were watching someone else's back instead of their own. He stamped the snow from his boots before pushing open the door to Wilcott's General Store, the warm air inside a welcome relief from the bitter cold. "Thomas, good to see you," Jacob Wilcott called from behind the counter. "Thought you'd have headed south for the winter with the rest of the Barty hands." Thomas shook his head. "Mr. Turner asked me to stay on, help with the stock through winter, pays extra." He glanced around the store, noting how bare the shelves looked. "Running low on supplies. Wagon from Denver's 3 weeks overdue. This snow," Jacob shook his head. "Getting worried about coal especially. Folks need heat." Thomas nodded, gathering the few supplies he needed: coffee, beans, ammunition. He was selecting a new hunting knife when the store's bell jingled, announcing another customer. She entered like a gust of warm summer air in the midst of winter's grip. 19, maybe 20 years old, with honey blonde hair peeking out from beneath a threadbare bonnet. Her blue dress had seen better days, patched in several places and hanging a bit loose on her slender frame. But it was her eyes, wide, amber, and filled with a desperate determination, that caught Thomas's attention. Despite her evident poverty, she carried herself with dignity, chin held high. "Mr. Wilcott," she said, her voice soft but steady, "I need coal, just enough to last a few days." Jacob's expression softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Granger, but I'm down to my last few sacks. Had to raise the price to $5 each with the shortage." Thomas watched as her face fell, though she quickly composed herself. "I understand," her fingers twisted the simple gold band on her left hand, "but my little sister is ill and our cabin is so cold." She hesitated, then with visible reluctance, slipped the wedding ring from her finger and placed it on the counter. "Would this be enough? It's all I have of value." Something in Thomas's chest tightened at the sight. He'd seen plenty of desperation in his years on the frontier, men selling prized horses for food, trading family heirlooms for medicine. But there was something about this woman, about the way she held herself so proudly even as she offered up what was clearly precious to her, that struck him. Before Jacob could respond, Thomas stepped forward. "Ma'am, keep your ring." He placed $5 on the counter. "Jacob, put a sack of coal on my account for Mrs. Granger." Both Jacob and the young woman looked at him in surprise. "I cannot accept charity, sir," she said, her cheeks flushing. "I don't know you." "Thomas Forrester, ma'am, Barty Ranch." He tipped his hat slightly. "And it's not charity, consider it a loan if you prefer." Her amber eyes studied him suspiciously. "A loan implies repayment, Mr. Forrester." "I have nothing to offer." "Information, then," he found himself continuing, unsure why he was pressing the issue. "I'm looking to buy a small plot of land come spring, could use local knowledge." The suspicion in her eyes didn't fade entirely, but after a moment she nodded. "Very well, I'm Abigail Granger." She carefully returned the wedding ring to her finger. "My cabin is northeast of town, past Miller's Creek. You can call on me for your information when the weather breaks." Jacob loaded the coal into a small sack, which Thomas carried out to the small wagon waiting outside. A girl of perhaps 12 sat huddled under blankets, her face pale and drawn. "Thank you," Abigail whispered as he placed the coal in the back. "Few show such kindness to strangers here." "It's nothing," he replied gruffly, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Take care of your sister." As he watched her wagon disappear into the swirling snow, Thomas silently berated himself. Getting involved with other people's troubles was exactly what he'd sworn never to do. The West didn't reward saviors or heroes, it buried them. And yet, as he mounted his horse to return to the Barty, he couldn't shake the image of those amber eyes, proud even in desperation. "Fool," he muttered to himself as he urged his horse through the deepening snow. "You're a damned fool, Thomas Forrester." The next morning brought no relief from the cold. Thomas rode fence line, checking for breaks where cattle might wander into the deadly embrace of winter. His thoughts kept returning to Abigail Granger, a widow, obviously and young for such a fate, taking care of a sick sister with barely enough to survive. Not your concern, he reminded himself. Everyone out here had a story of loss and struggle. You couldn't save them all. You couldn't save any of them really except yourself. But 3 days later, when he rode into town for mail, he found himself purchasing extra supplies, medicine, canned goods, more coal, and directing his horse toward Miller's Creek. The Granger cabin was small, the logs well fitted but in need of chinking to keep out the wind. Smoke curled from the chimney, a reassuring sign. As he approached, the door opened, and Abigail stepped out, a shotgun held carefully in her hands. "Mr. Forrester," she said, lowering the weapon when she recognized him. "I wasn't expecting visitors." "Just passing by," he lied, dismounting. "Thought I'd check how your sister fares." Her expression softened slightly. "Better, thank you." The coal made a difference, she hesitated. "Would you care to come in? I have coffee." The sensible thing would be to refuse, to leave the supplies and ride away. Instead, Thomas found himself nodding. "Much obliged, Mrs. Granger." The cabin's interior was sparse but meticulously clean. A few pieces of simple furniture, handmade by the look of them. A small bookshelf with perhaps a dozen books. In one corner, the young girl from town lay on a narrow bed, sleeping restlessly. "My sister Emily," Abigail explained, moving to a small stove to pour coffee. "The fever broke yesterday, but she's still weak." Thomas sat at the rough-hewn table, removing his hat. "You two out here alone?" A shadow passed over her face. "Yes, my husband James died last spring, rockfall at the mine." Her hand unconsciously touched the wedding ring. "We had come west together with such dreams." She stopped herself, straightening her shoulders. "But that's our business, not yours." "Of course," Thomas agreed, accepting the tin cup of coffee she offered. "I brought some supplies. Medicine that might help your sister, some food." Her eyes narrowed. "More charity, Mr. Forrester, or does this information you seek require advance payment?" Despite himself, Thomas smiled at her spirit. "Just being neighborly, Mrs. Granger." "Neighborly," she repeated, as if testing the word. "I've found little of that quality in Silver Creek, Mr. Forrester." "Thomas," he corrected. "And the West isn't known for its welcoming nature." "No," she agreed, sitting across from him. "It promises freedom and opportunity, but delivers isolation and hardship." She studied him over the rim of her cup. "What keeps you here, Thomas? You don't seem like most of the men who drift through these parts." The question caught him off guard. Few asked about his reasons, and fewer still would receive an honest answer. Yet something about Abigail Granger's direct gaze made lying feel impossible. "I came west with my father," he found himself saying. "He had big dreams, ranch of his own, cattle empire." He shrugged. "Died of fever before seeing any of it come true. By then, I'd lost my taste for dreams but couldn't face going back east to failure." "So you stayed, working someone else's land." "It's honest work. Keeps me fed and housed." He took a sip of coffee. "What about you? Why stay after your husband's passing? Most widows would return to family back east." "We have no family there," she replied, glancing at her sleeping sister. "And no money for the journey besides, but more than that," she looked out the small window at the snow-covered mountains. "This is our home now. James is buried here, and I made him a promise that Emily and I would claim our piece of this land, build something lasting." Her voice strengthened. "I intend to keep that promise." Thomas regarded her with new respect. Most men would have broken under the burden she carried, alone, caring for a sick child, fighting for survival in the unforgiving wilderness. Yet here she sat, determination burning like a flame that refused to be extinguished. "Land isn't easy to tame," he said, "especially not for a woman alone." Her eyes flashed. "Is that your experience with women, Mr. Forrester, that we break easily?" He held up his hands in surrender. "I meant no offense, just speaking plain truth. The West has killed stronger men than me." "Then it's fortunate I'm not a man," she replied with the ghost of a smile. Now about this information you claim to need, what land interests you? For the next hour they talked of property and water rights, of which valleys held the best grazing and which hillsides offered protection from winter storms. Thomas found himself impressed by her knowledge, gleaned from her husband's mining work and her own observations. He also found himself lingering longer than intended, reluctant to leave the warm cabin and the even warmer conversation. When Emily woke, coughing weakly, Abigail excused herself to tend to her sister. Thomas took the opportunity to bring in the supplies from his horse, arranging them discreetly on the counter before preparing to leave. "You've more than repaid any debt with your knowledge today," he said, donning his hat. "I won't trouble you further." Abigail walked him to the door, her expression unreadable. "You're an unusual man, Thomas Forrester." "How so?" "Most men out here want something, land, gold, power." She tilted her head, studying him. "I'm not certain what you want." "Neither am I," he thought, suddenly uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "Just trying to survive like everyone else." "No," she said softly, "not everyone is just surviving, some of us are trying to live." She extended her hand formally. "Thank you for your help." "Truly." When his hand closed around hers, Thomas felt a jolt of something he hadn't experienced in years: connection. Her fingers were calloused from work but still feminine, strong but gentle. He withdrew his hand perhaps too quickly. "Take care, Mrs. Granger, and your sister too." As he rode away, Thomas tried to shake the strange feeling that had settled over him. He'd done his good deed. Paid a debt that wasn't really his to pay. Now he could return to his solitary existence, secure in the knowledge that attachment was still the surest path to ruin on the frontier. But 2 weeks later, when a blizzard howled down from the mountains with killing force, his first thought was of the small cabin by Miller's Creek and its two vulnerable occupants. The storm had begun near midnight, the wind shrieking like a wounded animal as it tore at the bunkhouse where Thomas slept. By dawn, the world had disappeared beneath a blinding white curtain. No man with sense would venture out in such conditions. Yet by mid-morning, Thomas had saddled his most sure-footed horse, packed emergency supplies, and was fighting his way through snow drifts toward the Granger cabin, ignoring the protests of the ranch foreman. "This is madness, Forrester," the man had shouted as Thomas prepared to leave. "You'll freeze to death before you're halfway there." Perhaps he was right. As the cold penetrated his layers of clothing and the wind tried to tear him from the saddle, Thomas questioned his own sanity. What was he doing, risking his life for people who were nothing to him, who would likely be fine without his interference? It was nearly dusk when he finally spotted the cabin, barely visible through the storm. No smoke rose from the chimney, a bad sign. Forcing his exhausted horse the final distance, Thomas half fell from the saddle at the door, pounding with a gloved fist. "Mrs. Granger, Abigail." No answer came. With growing dread, he tried the door and found it unbarred. Inside, the cabin was as cold as a tomb, illuminated only by the faint gray light filtering through the windows. Emily lay bundled on her bed, and beside her, Abigail sat slumped in a chair, her face pale with cold. "Abigail," he rushed to her side, taking her icy hands in his. "Wake up." Her eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition. "Thomas, why are you here?" "The storm," he explained, already moving to the stove. "I feared you might need help." He found the wood box nearly empty, just a few sticks remaining. "Where's your coal?" "Gone," she whispered, shivering violently now. "Used the last of it yesterday, the wood." She gestured weakly toward the door. "Too wet to burn properly. I tried to reach the shed for more, but the snow." Thomas worked quickly, using skills honed through winters on the range. He retrieved dry wood from his saddlebags, not much, but enough to start a fire. Then he ventured back into the storm to find the woodshed Abigail had mentioned, returning with an armload of logs protected from the worst of the moisture. Within half an hour, he had a fire blazing in the stove, and the temperature in the cabin began to rise. He melted snow for water, then prepared a simple meal from his provisions. All the while, Abigail watched him with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. "Why did you come?" she asked finally, as Emily slept and they sat before the stove. "You could have died in that storm." Thomas stared into the flames, unable to meet her gaze. "I don't rightly know," he admitted. "Something told me you might need help." "You risked your life on a feeling." She shook her head in disbelief. "For strangers." "You're not exactly strangers anymore," he replied, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. "Besides, out here, people have to look out for each other sometimes." Is that so? A small smile touched her lips. I thought the West was no place for trust or connection, every man for himself. Thomas shifted in his chair. Generally speaking, yes, but extreme circumstances. Call for extreme measures, she finished for him. Like buying coal for a widow trying to trade her wedding ring. He had no answer for that. They sat in silence for a time, listening to the storm rage outside and the fire crackle within. I never thanked you properly, Abigail said softly, for that day at the store. It was more than the coal, it was the dignity you allowed me to keep. She twisted the ring on her finger. This was all I had left of James. Selling it would have been like losing him all over again. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest at her words. You don't need to thank me. I do, she insisted. Kindness is rare enough to deserve acknowledgement. She hesitated, then added, as is courage, coming through that blizzard to check on us. No one has cared about our welfare like that since James died. I'm sure the townspeople see a burden, she interrupted, a widow with a sickly sister taking up space and resources. Her voice hardened. They expect me to fail, to abandon our claim and disappear. It would be more convenient for them. And yet you stay. I stay, her amber eyes reflected the firelight, determination burning in their depths. This land is mine now, paid for in my husband's blood and my own sweat. I won't surrender it simply because the path is difficult. As the night deepened and the storm showed no signs of abating, it became clear Thomas would need to remain until morning. Abigail insisted he take her bed while she slept beside Emily, brushing aside his protests with practical logic. You need proper rest after that journey, she said firmly. And the bed is large enough for one man, not for a woman and a growing girl. Thomas had spent many nights in far worse conditions, but the simple bed felt like luxury after his ordeal in the storm. Still, sleep eluded him as he lay awake, listening to the soft breathing of Abigail and Emily across the room. His father's warnings echoed in his mind. Getting attached is getting dead. Love has no place on the frontier. Yet he couldn't deny that something had drawn him here, through a killing blizzard, to this cabin, something that defied his careful rules of survival. Morning brought clear skies and temperatures cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. Thomas dug pathways through the deep snow to the woodshed and the small barn where Abigail kept a milk cow and 2 chickens. The animals had survived, though the cow looked miserable from missed milkings. When he returned to the cabin, he found Abigail preparing breakfast. Color returned to her cheeks and strength to her movements. You've done enough, Mr. Forrester, she said when he tried to help. Please sit. Thomas, he reminded her. And I don't mind the works. She paused, wooden spoon in hand. No, I suppose you don't, her gaze was appraising. You're a puzzling man, you speak of isolation and self-reliance, yet your actions show something quite different. Before he could respond, Emily spoke up from her bed. He's like a hero from my storybooks, the girl said, her voice stronger than it had been during his previous visit, riding through a blizzard to save us. Thomas felt heat rise to his face. Hardly that, Miss Emily. Just being neighborly. Well, this neighbor is grateful, Abigail said, serving up plates of hot food, and indebted to you once again. No debt, Thomas insisted. Any decent man would have done the same. Her smile held a hint of sadness, if only that were true. After breakfast, Thomas reluctantly prepared to leave, aware that his absence from the party would be causing concern. As he saddled his horse, Abigail came to stand beside him, wrapped in a shawl against the cold. Will you come back, she asked suddenly, not for rescue or necessity, but as a friend? The question caught him off guard. Friendship wasn't something he sought or cultivated. Friends became liabilities in a land where survival often meant making hard choices. Yet looking at Abigail, her honey-blonde hair catching the winter sunlight and her amber eyes watching him with cautious hope, Thomas found himself nodding. I'd like that, he said, surprised to find he meant it. Sunday dinner, perhaps, a week from today. Emily would be delighted to have company, and she hesitated. I find I enjoy your conversation, contrary as we sometimes are. Sunday then, he mounted his horse, tipping his hat to her. Take care until then, Mrs. Granger. Abigail, she corrected with a small smile. Friends should use first names, don't you think? As Thomas rode back to the Barty, the vast, snow-covered landscape didn't seem quite as empty or forbidding as it had before. Something had shifted, as subtle as the changing of seasons, but just as significant. For the first time since his father's death, he found himself looking forward to something beyond the next day's work. The week passed slowly, filled with the usual winter chores of the ranch, feeding livestock, breaking ice on water troughs, repairing equipment in preparation for spring. Thomas found his thoughts frequently drifting to the small cabin and its inhabitants, wondering how they were faring after the storm. On Friday, a wagon from Denver finally made it through the mountain passes, bringing much-needed supplies to Silver Creek. Thomas purchased a bolt of warm blue fabric that reminded him of the color of Abigail's dress, as well as candies for Emily and coffee, real coffee, not the chicory blend that passed for it most days on the frontier. "Someone special getting these gifts?" the shopkeeper's wife asked with a knowing smile. "Just neighbors," Thomas replied, uncomfortable with her implication. "MMHMM," the woman hummed, clearly unconvinced. "The widow Granger is fortunate in her neighbors then." News traveled fast in small towns, and Thomas realized his blizzard rescue had become common knowledge. He paid for his purchases and left quickly, annoyed by the woman's insinuations, but also troubled by his own eagerness for Sunday to arrive. When it finally did, Thomas dressed in his best shirt, clean at least if somewhat worn, and rode to the Granger cabin with his gifts. The day was clear but cold, the snow crunching beneath his horse's hooves. Abigail greeted him at the door, dressed in a simple but neat dress of faded green, her hair arranged more carefully than he'd seen before. The cabin smelled of roasting meat and fresh bread, making his stomach growl appreciatively. "You came," she said, as if she'd half expected him not to. "I said I would." He handed her the packages awkwardly, "Just some things from town." The supply wagon finally made it through. Emily, looking much recovered from her illness, bounded over to inspect the gifts. Her delight at the candies was immediate and vocal, while Abigail ran her fingers over the fabric with reverent appreciation. "Thomas, this is too generous," she protested. "This must have cost." "It's nothing," he interrupted, "just something I thought might be useful." "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I haven't had a new dress since before James died." She looked up at him with shining eyes. "Thank you." The dinner that followed was the finest meal Thomas had eaten in months. Abigail had somehow managed to roast a small ham, accompanied by potatoes and preserved vegetables from her summer garden. The conversation flowed easily, with Emily chattering about her books and Abigail sharing stories of her childhood in Ohio. "And what about you, Thomas?" Abigail asked as they lingered over coffee afterward. "You've heard our histories, but you reveal little of yourself." Thomas shrugged, "Not much to tell. Grew up in Missouri, came west with my father when I was 18. Been working cattle ever since." "Surely there's more to your story than that," she pressed gently. "What brought you to Colorado specifically? What are your dreams for the future?" Dreams, the word itself made him uncomfortable. Dreams were dangerous things. They made men take foolish risks, chase illusions across unforgiving terrain. "My father had the dreams," he said finally. "I'm more practical. Work hard, save money, maybe buy a small place someday. Nothing grand." Emily, who had been listening intently, frowned. "But don't you want adventure, romance, like in stories?" Thomas smiled at the girl's innocence. "Stories are just that, Miss Emily. Real life is about surviving each day and hoping the next isn't worse." "What a bleak philosophy," Abigail commented. "Is that truly how you see the world?" "It's how the world is," he replied. "At least out here." "Then why stay?" She leaned forward, her expression earnest. "If the West offers nothing but hardship and isolation, why remain?" The question struck at something deep within him, something he rarely examined. "Because despite everything," he said slowly, "there's a freedom here that exists nowhere else. A chance to build something that's entirely your own, answerable to no one." Abigail's eyes softened. "So you do have dreams, Thomas Forrester. You've just buried them beneath practicality." The conversation shifted to other topics, but her observation lingered in his mind long after he'd bid them farewell and ridden back to the ranch. Had he abandoned his dreams or merely tempered them with reality? And when had survival alone become enough? Over the following weeks, Sunday dinners at the Granger cabin became a ritual. Thomas would arrive with small gifts, never expensive but thoughtful. A book for Emily, seeds for Abigail's spring garden, tools to repair loose boards on the porch. In return, Abigail shared meals and conversation that nourished something in him that had been starving for far longer than his stomach ever had. As February gave way to March and the first hints of spring began to appear, Thomas found himself spending Saturdays at the cabin as well, helping with repairs that James Granger had never completed. He built shelves, reinforced the roof, and constructed a proper chicken coop to replace the ramshackle one that predated the Grangers' arrival. "You didn't have to do all this," Abigail said one Saturday as they stood admiring the finished coop. "But I'm grateful. James was a good man and a hard worker, but he was a miner, not a builder." "How did you meet him?" Thomas asked, realizing he knew little about their story. "Back in Ohio," she replied, a wistful smile touching her lips. "I was 16, he was 22. My father opposed the match, thought James was beneath me because he worked with his hands." She shook her head at the memory. "When James heard about the silver strikes in Colorado, he saw a chance for us to start fresh, away from my family's disapproval." "So you came west as newlyweds?" "Barely more than children, with Emily in tow after our parents died of influenza." Abigail's expression grew somber. "James promised me a fine house with glass windows and a garden. He worked himself to exhaustion in those mines, trying to make that promise real." Thomas heard the grief in her voice and felt an unfamiliar urge to comfort her. Hesitantly, he placed a hand on her shoulder. "He sounds like a good man." "The best," she agreed, looking up at him with eyes that held both sadness and something warmer. "But even good men can't predict rock falls or widowmakers in the mine shafts." They stood in silence for a moment, his hand still resting on her shoulder, her nearness creating a strange tension in the air between them. Then Emily called from the cabin, breaking the spell, and they moved apart as if by mutual consent. That evening, as Thomas prepared to leave, Abigail walked him to his horse. "I've been meaning to ask," she said, her tone casual though her eyes were watchful. "The land you mentioned wanting to buy, have you found a suitable plot?" "I've been looking at a piece just north of here," he admitted. "Good water, decent grazing, not too far from town." "Or from us," she observed quietly. Thomas busied himself with his saddle straps, avoiding her gaze. "That would be a benefit," he acknowledged, heart pounding unexpectedly. "Thomas," her voice made him look up. "What are we doing, these visits, the gifts, the help around the cabin?" "Being neighborly," he said automatically, falling back on the explanation he'd given himself repeatedly. "Is that all?" Her amber eyes searched his face. "Because neighbors don't usually ride through blizzards for each other. They don't spend every weekend helping with repairs or bringing gifts." Thomas felt cornered, caught between the truth he was beginning to recognize and the safety of denial. "Abigail, It's all right," she interrupted, stepping back slightly. "I shouldn't have spoken, it's too soon and I'm still." She twisted the wedding ring on her finger. "James's widow," Thomas finished for her, understanding dawning. "And I'm just a cowhand with nothing to offer but occasional help." "That's not what I meant," frustration colored her voice. "I meant it's too soon for me to know my own heart. James has been gone less than a year and I never expected to feel." She stopped, shaking her head. "Forget I spoke, please continue visiting. Emily adores you and I value your friendship greatly." "Friendship?" The word both relieved and disappointed him. "Of course," he said, mounting his horse. "Sunday as usual then." She nodded, her expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. "Sunday." As Thomas rode back to the Barty, confusion churned within him. What had she been about to say? What did he want her to say? And why did the thought of being merely friends with Abigail Granger leave him feeling hollow? His father's warnings echoed in his mind. Love is a luxury men on the frontier can't afford. It makes you weak when you need to be strong. It divides your focus when you need to be vigilant. But for the first time, Thomas questioned whether his father had been right. Was isolation truly the key to survival in the West, or was it possible that connection, having someone to fight for, to build with, might make the struggle more worthwhile? The following day, a telegram arrived at the Barty that would force Thomas to confront these questions head-on. Outlaws had robbed the Denver-bound stagecoach, killing the driver and a passenger before fleeing into the mountains. The territorial marshal was forming a posse to pursue them, and every able-bodied man was being called to join. "You don't have to go," the ranch foreman told Thomas as they read the notice posted in town. "Barty needs hands here." But Thomas knew his duty. He had skills as a tracker and with a rifle that would be valuable to the posse. Besides, outlaws left unchecked would only grow bolder, threatening everyone in the region, including the Grangers. "I'll go," he said firmly. "How soon do we leave?" "First light tomorrow, pack for a week in the mountains." That evening, Thomas rode to the Granger cabin to explain his absence for the upcoming Sunday. Abigail listened to his news with growing concern. "These men have already killed," she said, her hands twisting in her apron. "They'll not hesitate to kill again if cornered." "That's why they need to be caught," Thomas replied, "before they harm anyone else. And it has to be you that goes." Her voice held a note of accusation. "There must be 20 men in town who could join this posse. Most haven't spent winters tracking in these mountains." He studied her anxious face, a warm feeling spreading through his chest at her obvious concern for his safety. "I'll be careful, Abigail, I promise." She nodded, though worry still lined her face. "How long will you be gone?" "A week, maybe 2 if the trail is difficult." "Then you should take provisions." She bustled around the cabin, gathering food into a bundle. "Dried meat, biscuits, coffee, better than whatever the marshal will provide, I'm sure." As she worked, Emily approached Thomas, her young face solemn. "Are you going to catch the bad men?" "We're going to try," he answered honestly. "Will they try to shoot you?" Thomas glanced at Abigail, who had paused in her packing to listen for his answer. "They might," he said carefully, "but I'll be with many other men and we'll watch out for each other." Emily considered this, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small carved wooden horse. "Take this for luck," she said, pressing it into his hand. "Papa gave it to me, but you can borrow it until you come back." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat at the child's gesture. "I'll guard it with my life," he promised, tucking the carving carefully into his shirt pocket. When the provisions were packed and the time came to leave, Abigail walked him outside. The evening was cool but not cold, the first true promise of spring in the air. "Be careful," she said again. "These mountains can be as dangerous as any outlaw." "I know these lands," he assured her. "And I have every reason to return safely." Something in his tone made her look up sharply. Their eyes met, and in that moment the unspoken feelings between them seemed to crystallize into something neither could deny. "Thomas," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "when you return." He didn't let her finish. Acting on impulse, he leaned down and pressed his lips gently to hers. The kiss was brief, almost chaste, but it sent a current of electricity through his entire body. When he pulled back, Abigail's eyes were wide with surprise, her cheeks flushed. "I'll come back," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And then we'll talk about everything." She nodded, seemingly unable to speak. Her fingers touched her lips briefly, as if preserving the feeling of the kiss. Then she straightened, composing herself. "I'll hold you to that promise, Thomas Forrester. Now go catch those outlaws and return safely." With a final nod, Thomas mounted his horse and rode toward town, his mind whirling with the implications of what had just happened. He had crossed a line when he had sworn never to approach. Yet instead of regret, he felt only a fierce determination to survive the coming days and return to Abigail's side. The posse departed at dawn, 12 men led by Marshal Wilson, a grizzled veteran of the frontier with a reputation for relentlessness. The trail led into the high country, where patches of snow still clung to north-facing slopes and nights remained bitterly cold. They traveled hard, following signs of the outlaws' passage, campfire remains, horse droppings, the occasional discarded item. On the 4th day, they found the body of one of the outlaws, apparently killed in some dispute with his companions. On the 6th day, they spotted smoke from a campfire on a distant ridge and knew they had their quarry. "We'll approach at first light," Marshal Wilson decided. "Come at them from 3 directions. No chances, these men are killers." That night, as Thomas took his turn at watch, he found himself touching the wooden horse in his pocket, thinking of Emily and Abigail waiting for his return. For the first time in years, he had someone to go back to, someone who would grieve if he didn't return. It was a sobering thought, one that made him acutely aware of the dangers ahead. The marshal's plan worked perfectly, until it didn't. The outlaws were indeed where the smoke had indicated, but they had posted a sentry who spotted the posse's approach. Gunfire erupted as the lawmen closed in, bullets splintering trees and kicking up dirt around them. Thomas took cover behind a boulder, returning fire when he could spot a target. The exchange continued for nearly an hour, a deadly game of patience as each side waited for the other to make a mistake. The mistake, when it came, was not from the outlaws but from within the posse. One of the younger men, believing the outlaws were about to flee, broke cover to pursue. He was cut down immediately, his body crumpling in the open ground between the 2 forces. "Damn fool," muttered the man next to Thomas. "Now they'll think we're desperate." Indeed, the outlaws seemed emboldened by the death, increasing their rate of fire and attempting to outflank the posse. Marshal Wilson ordered a strategic withdrawal to better positions, but as they moved, another posse member was hit, the bullet taking him in the shoulder. Thomas helped drag the wounded man to safety, bullets whistling past them as they retreated. The marshal's face was grim as he assessed their situation. "They have the high ground and plenty of ammunition," he observed. "We need to flush them out." The plan he proposed was dangerous. Thomas and two others would circle behind the outlaws' position, while the rest of the posse maintained fire from the front. If successful, they would catch the criminals in a crossfire with no escape. The circling maneuver took over 2 hours, the three men moving silently through the forest, alert for any sign they'd been detected. As they approached the outlaws' camp from behind, Thomas could see three men crouched behind fallen logs, firing occasionally at the posse below. The trap was sprung with devastating efficiency. At Marshal Wilson's signal, 3 rapid shots, Thomas and his companions opened fire from behind while the main posse charged from the front. Caught by surprise, 2 of the outlaws fell immediately. The third threw down his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. The victory was not without cost. Besides the young man killed in the initial exchange, another posse member had taken a bullet in the leg during the final assault. As they secured their prisoner and gathered their dead and wounded, Thomas felt no triumph, only a weary relief that he had survived and could fulfill his promise to return to Abigail. The journey back to Silver Creek was slow, hampered by the need to transport their casualties and prisoner. They arrived 9 days after departing, the town turning out to greet them with a mixture of celebration and mourning. Thomas declined offers of drinks at the saloon, wanting only to clean up and ride to the Granger cabin. But as he was stabling his horse, the ranch foreman found him with troubling news. "There's been trouble while you were gone," the man said without preamble. "The widow Granger's claim is being challenged. Man named Harlan Dowd says he has papers proving he bought the mineral rights from her husband before his death." Thomas felt his blood run cold. "That's impossible. James Granger would never have sold those rights without telling his wife." "Maybe, maybe not," the foreman shrugged. "But Dowd has documentation with what appears to be Granger's signature, and the county recorder is inclined to honor it. If it stands, Dowd can mine the property regardless of who owns the surface rights." "Where is this Dowd now?" "In town, staying at the hotel. Word is he's already hired men to begin surveying the property." Without another word, Thomas mounted his horse and rode hard for the Granger cabin. The evening was drawing in as he arrived, finding Abigail chopping wood with grim determination, her face set in lines of anger and worry. She looked up at the sound of his approach, relief washing over her features. "Thomas. You're alive." He dismounted quickly and she dropped the axe to rush toward him. For a moment they simply stood, drinking in the sight of each other. Then Abigail stepped back, composure returning. "You've heard," she asked, gesturing vaguely toward town. "About Dowd's claim? Yes, tell me what happened." Inside the cabin, as Emily slept, Abigail explained. 3 days after Thomas left with the posse, Harlan Dowd had appeared at her door with documents claiming to have purchased the mineral rights to her property from James 6 months before his death for the sum of $500. "It's a lie," Abigail said, her voice low but intense. "James would never have sold those rights. They were our security, our future. And if he had, the money would have been in our bank account or hidden somewhere in this cabin. There was nothing, not a dollar." "Have you seen these documents?" She nodded grimly. "Yesterday at the recorder's office. The signature, it looks like James's hand, but something about it feels wrong. And the witness signatures are from men I've never heard of." Thomas paced the small cabin thinking, Dowd must have forged the papers, but proving that won't be easy, especially with James gone. "The recorder gave me 3 days to produce evidence contradicting Dowd's claim," Abigail said. "After that, he'll register the mineral rights transfer officially. And once that happens, Dowd can bring in mining equipment, tear up your land, pollute your water." Thomas ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Did James keep any papers, letters, anything that might show his intentions for the property?" "Everything he had is in that trunk," she replied, pointing to a small chest in the corner. "I've been through it a dozen times since Dowd appeared. There's nothing that specifically mentions the mineral rights." Thomas examined the trunk's contents: personal letters, a journal, the deed to the property, various receipts and documents related to James's mining work. Nothing that would definitively prove he hadn't sold the mineral rights. What about the bank? Would they have records of any large deposits around the time Dowd claims to have paid James? Abigail's eyes widened. I hadn't thought to check. We had so little money that I rarely visited the bank. But yes, if $500 had been deposited, there would be a record. First thing tomorrow then, Thomas decided, and I want to see these documents of Dowd's myself. There might be something you missed, a discrepancy in dates, an irregularity in the paper or ink. They talked late into the night, strategizing. When Abigail finally insisted Thomas get some rest after his long journey, she prepared a pallet for him near the stove, the only appropriate place for him to sleep in the small cabin. As Thomas lay awake, listening to the soft breathing of Abigail and Emily, determination hardened within him. He had seen too many honest settlers cheated by unscrupulous speculators, too many widows and orphans pushed off their land by those with more money and influence. He would not let that happen to Abigail, not while he had breath in his body. Morning brought new resolve. They rode into town together, first stopping at the bank where, as Abigail had suspected, there was no record of any $500 deposit in the months before or after the alleged sale. Next, they visited the county recorder's office to examine Dowd's documents more carefully. The clerk, a thin man named Peterson, seemed uncomfortable under Thomas's scrutiny. The papers appear to be in order, Peterson insisted, though he avoided meeting Thomas's eyes. Mr. Dowd has sworn to their authenticity, and the signatures of the witnesses support his claim. Thomas studied the document, paying particular attention to the date October 12, 1868, and the signatures of the witnesses. Henry Marsh and Samuel Jenkins, these witnesses, he said, where are they now? Mr. Dowd indicated they were associates who have since returned east, Peterson replied. Convenient, Thomas muttered, and what about the notary seal? Who verified these signatures? Peterson pointed to a faded seal at the bottom of the document. It appears to be from a notary in Denver. Given the legitimate appearance of the document, and without clear evidence to the contrary, I have little choice but to register the transfer. As they left the office, Thomas's mind was working furiously. Something about the document bothered him, but he couldn't pinpoint what. They were walking toward the hotel where Dowd was staying when Thomas suddenly stopped. The date, he said. October 12, 1868. What about it? Abigail asked. Where was James on that date? Would he have been in town to sign such a document? Abigail frowned in concentration. October. That would have been during the cave-in at the Silverton mine. James worked double shifts for nearly 2 weeks helping with the rescue and recovery. Her eyes widened. He wouldn't have had time to negotiate mineral rights. He barely came home to sleep. Is there anyone who could verify that? Someone who worked with James during that time. Michael Donovan, she said immediately. He was James's shift leader. He still works at the mine. They found Donovan at the mine office, a grizzled man with hands gnarled from years of hard labor. When they explained the situation, his weathered face darkened with anger. October 12. No, sir, James Granger wasn't signing any papers that day. He was 100 feet underground with me and 6 other men, digging out bodies after the support beams collapsed. He spat tobacco juice in disgust. Worked 36 hours straight, he did, determined to find those trapped miners, even when we all knew they were likely dead. Would you be willing to sign an affidavit stating that? Thomas asked. Damn right I would, Donovan declared. James Granger was as honest a man as ever swung a pickaxe. If he'd sold those rights, he'd have told his wife and had the money to show for it. Armed with Donovan's statement and the bank records showing no large deposit, Thomas and Abigail confronted Harlan Dowd at the hotel. He was a corpulent man with expensive clothes and the smooth manner of someone accustomed to getting his way through charm or intimidation. Mr. Forrester, Mrs. Granger, he greeted them with exaggerated politeness. I understand you have concerns about my legitimate business transaction with the late Mr. Granger. Legitimate? Thomas's voice was cold. James Granger couldn't have signed your document on October 12. He was working rescue at the Silverton mine, a fact multiple witnesses can confirm. Dowd's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. Perhaps the date on the document is in error. The transaction certainly took place, regardless of the exact day. And the $500 you allegedly paid him, Abigail demanded. There's no record of such a deposit in our bank account. Many miners prefer to keep their money close rather than trusting banks, Dowd replied smoothly. Perhaps your husband had his reasons for not telling you about the transaction. Men often shield their wives from financial matters. Thomas stepped closer, his patience wearing thin. Let's be plain, Dowd, your document is a forgery. James Granger never sold you those mineral rights. You're trying to steal from a widow and a child, and I won't allow it. Dowd's facade of politeness evaporated. You won't allow it, he sneered. And who are you to interfere in a legal matter between me and Mrs. Granger? Some ranch hand playing at being a hero? His eyes narrowed. Or perhaps something more to the widow already. That was quick work, ma'am. Abigail's face flushed with anger. How dare you, she said, her voice shaking. My husband is barely cold in his grave, and you not only attempt to steal what he left to protect us but also slander my character. I merely observe what seems apparent, Dowd replied with a malicious smile. In any case, my claim will be registered tomorrow, unless you can produce more substantial evidence than the word of a miner and bank records that prove nothing about how Mr. Granger may have handled cash. As they left the hotel, Thomas fought to control his anger. He's right about one thing: we need more concrete evidence. The recorder seems inclined to side with Dowd, especially if there's money changing hands behind closed doors. Abigail walked beside him, her face troubled. What more can we do? James is gone, and with him any chance of proving what he did or didn't do. Thomas stopped, struck by a sudden thought. Not necessarily. You said James kept a journal. Yes, but I've read it. There's nothing about mineral rights. May I see it anyway? Sometimes an outsider notices things the owner misses. That evening back at the cabin, Thomas carefully read through James Granger's journal. The entries were sporadic, mostly brief notes about mining conditions, plans for improvements to the cabin, and observations about Abigail and Emily. As October 1868 approached, the entries became more frequent, documenting the cave-in at the Silverton mine and the desperate rescue efforts. October 12 had a short but clear entry, 30 hours now without sleep. Found Williamson's body today, still looking for Morris and the Kendrick boy. Pray we find them alive but losing hope. Here, Thomas said, showing Abigail the entry. Proof that James was at the mine on the day Dowd claims he signed over the mineral rights. Will it be enough? She asked, doubt clouding her features. Dowd will simply say the date on his document is wrong. Thomas continued reading, searching for anything that might help their case. Then, in an entry from December, he found it, approached today by H.D. About selling mineral rights, offered $300, laughed him off. This land will provide for my family long after I'm gone. No amount would be worth losing that security. H.D. Thomas said triumphantly. Harlan Dowd. James not only didn't sell to him, he specifically refused an offer. Abigail read the entry, hope dawning in her eyes. And it's dated December, 2 months after Dowd claims to have already purchased the rights. This proves he's lying. The next morning, they presented their evidence to Marshal Wilson, who had returned from delivering the captured outlaw to the territorial prison. The marshal examined the journal entries and Donovan's affidavit with careful attention. This is troubling, he said finally. Falsifying documents to steal property rights is a serious crime. He looked at Thomas and Abigail. I'll speak to the county recorder and examine Dowd's document myself. In the meantime, I suggest you find a lawyer to represent Mrs. Granger's interests. The only lawyer in Silver Creek was Edgar Peabody, a young man who had arrived just 6 months earlier, fresh from law school in Boston. Despite his inexperience, he grasped the importance of the case immediately. Mineral rights disputes are becoming common as more Eastern money flows into mining operations, he explained. But this is particularly egregious, attempting to defraud a widow using clearly forged documents. With Peabody's help, they built their case. James's journal entries, Donovan's testimony about the mine rescue, bank records showing no large deposit, and character witnesses who could attest to James Granger's honesty and devotion to providing for his family. The hearing before the county judge was set for the following Monday. As they prepared, Abigail grew increasingly anxious. What if it's not enough? She asked Thomas the evening before the hearing. Dowd has money and influence. He's already hired men to begin survey work, as if the outcome is certain. They sat on the porch of her cabin, the spring evening warm enough to be comfortable outside. Emily had gone to bed, leaving them alone with their thoughts and fears. It will be enough, Thomas assured her, though his own doubts nagged at him. The truth is on our side. The truth doesn't always win in this world, she replied softly. I've seen too much to believe that. Thomas took her hand, a gesture that had become natural between them in recent days. Whatever happens tomorrow, you won't face it alone. I promise you that. She looked at him, her amber eyes reflecting the last light of day. Why, Thomas? Why have you done all this, risking your job, your reputation, perhaps even your safety for us? The question hung in the air between them, demanding truth. Thomas had been asking himself the same thing, and finally he had an answer. Because you made me remember something I'd forgotten, he said. That surviving isn't the same as living. That walls built to keep out pain also keep out joy. He squeezed her hand gently. My father believed connection was weakness, that love had no place on the frontier. But watching you fight for your home, for Emily, for the future James wanted you to have, I realized he was wrong. And what did you realize was right? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That finding someone worth fighting alongside makes the battle worthwhile. He met her gaze directly. I love you, Abigail. I think I have since that day in the store when you tried to trade your wedding ring for coal, and I couldn't bear to see you lose that last connection to a man who'd loved you enough to bring you west to build a life with you. Tears filled her eyes, glinting in the fading light. I've felt so guilty, she confessed, for feeling this way about you when James has been gone less than a year, for allowing myself to imagine a future different from the one he and I planned. What do you imagine? Thomas asked, his heart pounding. You here with us, she said simply, not just visiting on Sundays but every day, helping me work this land, watching Emily grow. She touched the wedding ring she still wore. I'll always love James, he was my first love, my children's father, but my heart has room for a second chance at happiness if you truly want that too. Thomas lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. I want nothing more, he promised. Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it together, and afterward, if you'll have me, I want to build that future with you. Their kiss this time was neither hesitant nor brief. It was a promise, a declaration, a commitment to face whatever came next as one. The courtroom the next day was crowded, the town having taken keen interest in the dispute between the widow and the wealthy Easterner. Judge Harrison, a stern man with a reputation for fairness, presided over the proceedings with impassive attention as each side presented their case. Dowd's lawyer went first, presenting the document with James's purported signature and arguing that Mrs. Granger was simply unaware of her husband's business dealings. He suggested that James might have hidden the money to surprise his wife later, or perhaps spent it on some unknown purpose. When it was their turn, Peabody methodically dismantled the claim. He presented the journal entries, Donovan's testimony, and the bank records. He called character witnesses who testified to James Granger's devotion to his family and his frequent statements about keeping the mineral rights as security for their future. The most damning evidence came when Peabody called a surprise witness, a clerk from the Denver notary office whose seal appeared on Dowd's document. The young man testified that the seal was indeed from their office, but the notary whose name appeared beside it had died 3 months before the document was allegedly signed. As the evidence mounted against him, Dowd's composure cracked. When Judge Harrison began to ask pointed questions about the document's authenticity, Dowd suddenly stood. This is a farce, he declared. I purchased those rights fairly, and no backwater judge in a mining town is going to tell me otherwise. Sit down, Mr. Dowd, the judge ordered sharply. One more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt. Dowd complied, but his face was mottled with rage. When the judge finally delivered his ruling, finding that the document was clearly fraudulent and that all mineral rights remained with Abigail as James Granger's legal heir, Dowd stormed from the courtroom, his lawyer hurrying after him. The crowd erupted in cheers, surrounding Abigail with congratulations and support. Thomas stood slightly apart, watching her face glow with relief and vindication. In that moment, seeing her strength and dignity in victory, he knew with absolute certainty that his future belonged with her and Emily. Later, as they celebrated at the cabin with a special dinner, Emily asked the question that had been on all their minds. Does this mean we get to keep our home forever? Yes, sweetheart, Abigail assured her, glancing at Thomas with a smile. This land is ours just as Papa wanted. And will Mr. Thomas stay with us now? The girl pressed, her innocent question bringing a blush to Abigail's cheeks. Thomas cleared his throat. Well, Miss Emily, that depends on whether your sister would consider a certain proposition. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small, simple ring he'd purchased that morning. I'm not a wealthy man, and I can't promise the fine house with glass windows that James dreamed of giving you. But I can promise to love you and Emily with everything I have, to work this land alongside you, and to honor James's memory by helping you build the future he wanted for you both." Abigail's eyes filled with tears as he knelt beside her chair. "Abigail Granger, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Emily gasped in delight but remained silent, watching her sister with wide eyes. "Yes," Abigail whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Thomas Forrester, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger next to the gold band from James, Thomas felt a sense of completion he'd never known before. His father had been wrong, love wasn't weakness on the frontier. It was strength, it was what made the hardship, the danger, the isolation bearable. It was what transformed mere survival into truly living. 2 months later, on a perfect June morning, Thomas and Abigail were married in the small church in Silver Creek. Emily served as bridesmaid, beaming with joy as she watched her sister begin a new chapter in their lives. The entire town turned out for the celebration, the same people who had once whispered about the widow's prospects now toasting the couple's happiness. With his savings and a small loan, Thomas purchased the land he'd been eyeing north of town. Over the summer, they built a new house there, not grand but solid and warm, with large windows that let in the sunlight Abigail loved. They kept her cabin too, using the land for additional grazing and preserving it as a memorial to James and the dream that had brought the Grangers west. As autumn painted the mountains with gold and crimson, Thomas stood on the porch of their new home, watching Abigail and Emily in the garden, harvesting the last vegetables before frost. His heart swelled with a contentment he'd never thought possible. The West was still a harsh land, unforgiving of mistakes and weak resolve. But Thomas no longer believed that meant a man had to face it alone, walled off from connection and love. Sometimes the greatest strength came from having someone to fight for, someone to build with, someone to love. And sometimes the most important journeys began with the smallest acts of kindness, like stopping a desperate widow from trading her wedding ring for coal on a cold winter's day.